How would you feel if I took you in a lab, made you drink copious amounts of seawater, and studied the effects because I don't know if seawater is safe to drink or not? What do you mean I should have tried it on myself? I don't want to. Besides, it's completely legal, or used to be legal. Anyway, many experiments in history were like this, scary to think of, even scarier to be a part of. The cherry on top here is most of these were legal on paper. So even if you tried to oppose to the idea, the law permits it. I'll give you some of them. High-altitude experiments. In 1942, inside the Dachau concentration camp, SS Dr. Sigmund Rascher ran a series of medical experiments that had one job, and it was to test how high a German pilot could go before his body stopped working. To pull this off, Rascher used a low-pressure chamber that could simulate altitudes up to 68,000 feet. He didn't use test dummies or volunteers. He used prisoners. Around 200 men were picked for this thing, all pulled from the camp. They were locked into the chamber, had their oxygen slowly taken away, and were exposed to extreme simulated altitudes. These experiments caused violent physical effects. Victims lost consciousness, had seizures, and in many cases their lungs ruptured or they suffered air embolisms. Some of them died on the spot inside the chamber. Those who didn't were sometimes revived just to be put through it again. Sigmund Rascher took notes while they screamed. In a few cases, he had the bodies dissected immediately after they died. He wanted to see what their brains looked like while fresh, before decomposition. He also recorded how long it took them to die once the pressure dropped. His personal records included photographs, graphs, and even sketches during their last minutes. He reported his work to Heinrich Himmler, who supported the whole project under the excuse of improving Luftwaffe survival rates. The whole thing was run with military support, and the findings were intended to help Nazi pilots survive high-altitude flights or parachute ejections. Rascher believed that testing on prisoners gave more reliable data than using animals or volunteers. Most of the prisoners who went through the experiments were killed by the process. If they didn't die in the chamber, they were killed afterward. Roughly 80 of the 200 died during the tests, either from oxygen deprivation, trauma, or direct complications like embolisms. The rest were executed once Rascher no longer needed them. The experiments were considered legal under the Nazi regime. They had state support, full documentation, and direct supervision from SS leadership. No charges were brought against Sigmund Rascher at the time. He continued his work at Dachau with other human experiments that are probably going to be in this video. Sulfanilamide wound experiments. Nazis again. In 1942, at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, a group of Nazi doctors led a series of experiments that targeted female prisoners to study the effects of sulfanilamide, an early antibiotic. The goal was to replicate battlefield wounds, so the doctors sliced them open and filled the cuts with bacteria-laced material. They used pathogens like streptococcus, tetanus, and Clostridium perfringens. And to make sure the wounds stayed infected and nasty, they shoved in things like crushed glass, splinters, and bits of dirt. Sometimes they cut off circulation to a limb just to see how infection would spread when the tissue didn't get blood anymore. One of the main names behind this was Karl Gebhardt, the personal physician to Heinrich Himmler. Karl didn't believe penicillin was more effective than sulfanilamide and wanted to prove it by throwing the Hippocratic Oath off a cliff. So, he and a group of doctors, including Fritz Fischer and Herta Oberhauser, ran these experiments under the cover of wartime necessity. The test subjects, most of whom were Polish political prisoners, weren't asked. They were dragged in, strapped down, and cut open. Infections were either introduced or aggravated until the patients were crying in pain or slipping into fevered delirium. They weren't given proper treatment afterward either. Some died from sepsis. Some had their legs amputated after the infection was pushed too far. Some were left permanently crippled, and others were simply killed when they were no longer considered useful. The sulfanilamide itself wasn't some miracle cure. When it worked, it only did so in certain cases, mostly when the infection hadn't taken over too much of the tissue. But even then, the Nazis weren't documenting results with real scientific rigor. They were torturing people and scribbling down half-baked notes. Any success was unreliable. Most of the findings didn't even help the German military. The results weren't useful in combat triage or field medicine. The entire operation was closer to medieval butchery than modern science. And for the women who survived it, the trauma didn't stop when the wounds scabbed over. Many had to undergo further surgeries. Some were paraded in front of visiting Nazi officials as examples of bravery or sacrifice. Seawater potability experiments. At the Dachau concentration camp, a group of Nazi doctors led by Dr. Hans Eppinger ran a medical experiment involving roughly 90 Roma prisoners, testing if seawater could somehow be made drinkable for use by military personnel stranded at sea. The official justification was to evaluate dehydration treatments and explore desalination methods, but the experiment was already based on a question that had long been answered by real science. Seawater dehydrates the body instead of hydrating it. Despite this, Hans Eppinger and his team pushed forward, deciding to use real human beings as disposable test subjects to see how long a person could survive drinking seawater alone. You see the logic here? It's torture in the guise of science. That's why it was normal. Plus, it was Nazis that were doing it, so I'm not surprised. The prisoners, all of them Roma, were forced to consume seawater and chemically altered variants of it with no access to any other food or liquid. Some were given seawater that had been treated using a method called the Burka process, which involved adding silver nitrate to reduce the salt content. That chemical mix just made the whole thing even more toxic. Over the course of the experiment, the prisoners began to show extreme symptoms of dehydration. Their skin cracked, their eyes dried up, they stopped urinating. Some started hallucinating or became violently disoriented. Reports from the time described them licking freshly mopped floors for any trace of moisture, trying to wring liquid out of their clothes, and begging the guards for toilet water. Hans made them suffer through it all while taking notes. No anesthesia, no medical care, just daily observations while the organs of each test subject began to shut down. After a few days of seawater ingestion, most had become physically incapacitated. Many suffered seizures, and some entered a coma-like state. At least a few prisoners died directly as a result, though exact numbers weren't officially recorded. Many of the survivors, if you could call them that, were left with permanent internal damage. The known outcomes weren't in question. Freshwater is essential for survival, and seawater has always been toxic in large quantities. The human kidneys can't process salt water in a way that keeps the body hydrated. It was common knowledge at the time. Multiple medical journals had already covered it. The German Navy itself had reports warning against drinking seawater under any circumstances. J. Marion Sims' gynecological experiments. Between 1845 and 1849, Dr. J. Marion Sims began a series of gynecological experiments in Montgomery, Alabama. He focused on repairing vesicovaginal fistulas, a condition that caused a constant flow of urine from the bladder into the coochie due to prolonged labor. To develop a surgical technique for fixing this, he used enslaved black women as test subjects. The three most frequently mentioned women were named Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. Anarcha underwent the most procedures, reportedly enduring over 30 surgeries during this 4-year period. These were not clean, quiet operations in a modern hospital. They took place in a makeshift operating room behind Sims's house. He performed them with crude tools, no anesthesia, and in full awareness that ether had already been introduced in the 1840s and was available at the time. Sims rationalized not using anesthesia by saying black women didn't feel pain the same way white women did. This belief was a widely accepted racist medical myth. So Lucy, Betsy, Anarcha, and others were cut open while fully conscious, screaming, restrained, and with no way to say no. The women were owned by plantation families and loaned to Sims for the purpose of experimentation. There was no freedom to withdraw. Sims documented the outcomes carefully, noting when stitches failed, when the wound broke down, and when scar tissue formed. He kept doing this repeatedly, tweaking his suturing method each time. Once Sims felt confident in the procedure, he began performing it on white women, but this time, he used anesthesia. He then moved to New York and opened the first hospital for women, eventually gaining recognition for his contribution to gynecology. Meanwhile, the names of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy were buried under decades of medical applause. He even went on to become president of the American Medical Association and had statues erected in his honor. His defenders later argued that the women had the same condition and supposedly volunteered, ignoring that these women were enslaved, owned, and living under threat. There was no scenario where they could decline or escape the surgeries. San Quentin Prison Rejuvenation. In the 1910s, California prison surgeon Dr. Leo Stanley started cutting open inmates at San Quentin with the belief that criminal behavior could be surgically reversed. Leo's big idea was rejuvenation, which he thought he could trigger by transplanting testicles from executed prisoners into the living ones. He believed this would restore energy, masculinity, and maybe even cure the whole being a criminal problem. The state let him try it. So, he castrated the prisoners who'd just been executed and sewed them into men still doing time. No anesthesia standards, no consent process, no oversight, just Leo deciding who got what and how. When he ran out of dead bodies, he started castrating animals. Whatever was lying around, if it had a pair, prepare for despair. He'd chop them into bits and shove the pieces inside the inmates' bodies. Most of the time, this caused nasty infections, abscesses, pain, and permanent damage. Some of these men were left sterile, some got lifelong complications, and none of them had any idea what they were signing up for. He did hundreds of these transplants over a couple of decades, calling it medical research. There was no scientific control group, no peer-reviewed data, just Leo deciding what counted as progress. He even wrote papers bragging about his techniques. When he wasn't doing test swaps, he pushed hard on forced sterilizations. He He was a loud supporter of eugenics, and he had the power to make it policy inside San Quentin. He would sterilize inmates he considered unfit, which basically meant anyone with mental illness, developmental disorders, or just someone he didn't like the look of. California law backed this, so Leo didn't even need approval most of the time. The justification he gave was that sterilization and rejuvenation would stop repeat offenses, claiming that crime was linked to weak genetics or hormonal imbalance. He turned San Quentin into a workshop for these ideas, operating on hundreds of inmates under state protection. Some of these men were teenagers, others were terminally ill or mentally impaired. Leo rarely documented complications, and even when he did, he brushed them off as expected side effects. The medical ethics community didn't step in, and there was no institutional review board to stop him. Michigan flu virus trials. In 1941, at several psychiatric hospitals across Michigan, Dr. Thomas Francis and Dr. Jonas Salk ran influenza experiments using mentally ill patients as test subjects. These patients were not told what was happening to them and were not asked for permission. The doctors took live flu virus and sprayed it directly into the noses of the people locked up in those state-run asylums. There was no pretense of treatment, as this was purely for research on how the virus spread and affected the body. The patients selected for this testing were institutionalized and unable to consent, but that was exactly the point. They were a captive group who couldn't fight back, couldn't refuse, and couldn't tell anyone. The doctors believed it was easier to conduct trials on people who were already shut away from society. They wrote internal memos acknowledging that if the public found out about the trials being done on state hospital inmates, there'd be outrage. So instead of stopping, they kept it quiet. They chose not to ask for outside approval and didn't tell families or the public. Once exposed to the virus, the patients started getting sick. Some of them developed severe fevers, trouble breathing, and intense physical weakness. The doctors recorded symptoms and tracked the progression of the illness, collecting data while their subjects suffered. The goal was to understand how the flu moved between people, how quickly symptoms showed up, and how severe the disease could get in various conditions. Jonas Salk was still early in his career during this period. This was long before he became known for the polio vaccine. He and Thomas Francis were focused on infectious disease and wanted to collect as much first-hand data as possible. Instead of using volunteers, they used institutionalized people who didn't even know they were in a trial. Everything was done under the banner of science, and the institutions allowed it because these were state facilities run with minimal oversight. Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the United States Navy carried out an operation called Operation Sea Spray, where they loaded a Navy vessel with tanks of bacteria and parked it just off the coast of San Francisco. Over a span of 6 days, the crew sprayed Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi into the air, right where the city's wind patterns could carry the bacteria across the entire metropolitan area. They used giant blowers to release the germs, timed perfectly to blend with the morning fog, so no one could see anything strange. They logged the weather, monitored how far the bacteria spread, and recorded how many people would theoretically inhale the germs. They believed the bacteria were harmless to humans, which was the excuse for not telling the public anything about it. About a week after the spraying, doctors at Stanford Hospital started noticing an unusual spike in urinary tract infections and pneumonia-like illnesses. Normally, Serratia marcescens didn't show up in patient samples, but suddenly the hospital lab was seeing it in over 10 different patients, all within a very short window. Edward Nevin, a 75-year-old man recovering from surgery, developed a severe urinary tract infection from the bacteria. It spread to his heart valves and killed him within a few weeks. His doctors couldn't figure out how he was exposed to a microbe that almost never infected healthy people. The same hospital reported an increase in respiratory symptoms from multiple unrelated patients, all within the same month. The military never told any hospitals, doctors, or public health officials that they had released bacteria across a city of over 800,000 people. They wanted to study how well biological weapons would spread in a real urban environment, with unpredictable wind patterns, varied elevations, and dense populations. They chose San Francisco because of its layout and the consistent ocean breeze. The goal was to estimate how many people would get sick or die in a real biological attack. The Navy wrote reports claiming the test was a success. This was just one test out of over 80 similar experiments carried out in other American cities between the 1940s and 1960s. The Army also sprayed bacteria in subways, bus stations, and office buildings in places like New York, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. All of these were done without any consent from the public. The government classified the operations for decades, and nothing came out until the 1970s when journalists and lawsuits forced agencies to declassify the documents. Frank Olsen experiment. In November 1953, a group of CIA scientists gathered at a secluded retreat at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. Among them was Frank Olsen, a bacteriologist and biological warfare researcher who worked for the CIA through the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. The retreat was supposed to be a casual, internal meeting for brainstorming and collaboration. But without warning, Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist heading the CIA's MK-Ultra program, slipped LSD into the drinks of several men, including Frank. None of them were told what they were ingesting. It was part of an internal experiment to observe how field agents might respond to unexpected exposure to psychotropic substances. Frank started acting erratic, confused, and paranoid. The episode didn't wear off. His mental state stayed unstable for days. He started expressing doubts about his work and talking about quitting. He also started mentioning classified programs and biological weapon activities to his family and coworkers. This made his bosses nervous. 9 days later, Frank checked into the Hotel Statler in New York City with CIA handler Robert Lashbrook, supposedly to see a doctor. Frank ended up dead on the sidewalk, having fallen from the 13th floor. The CIA claimed he took his own life. They told his wife, Alice Olsen, that Frank had suffered a breakdown and jumped. They sent flowers and closed the case, but none of it added up. There was no note. Frank had made plans to return home. His injuries weren't consistent with a clean jump. The hotel room had no signs of a struggle, but also no obvious setup for someone preparing to kill themselves. Alice and the rest of the family were left with questions, none of which got real answers. For decades, they were kept in the dark. In 1975, the case surfaced again during the Church Committee hearings on intelligence abuses. That's when the family learned that Frank had been drugged with LSD as part of MK-Ultra. President Gerald Ford invited the family to the White House and issued a formal apology. They were paid a $750,000 settlement in exchange for dropping further legal action. But no one ever went to jail. No one got fired. The case was wrapped up as a tragic mistake. Operation Big Itch. In the mid-1950s, the U.S. Army rolled out a biological warfare test at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah called Operation Big Itch. The whole point was to see if fleas could be used as delivery systems in war. Actual fleas, the kind that bite and carry diseases. The military didn't infect them with anything, but the type they picked, which was Xenopsilla chiopus, or rat fleas, were known for carrying bubonic plague. They loaded these fleas into bombs, or more specifically, E-14 canisters that held around 100,000 of the little freaks. The bombs were dropped from aircraft flying over the desert, and when they hit the ground, they burst open to scatter the fleas across test zones. They used guinea pigs as bait, placing them inside cages and letting the fleas crawl in. Turns out, the fleas were very much alive and ready to do their thing once they were released. They clung to the guinea pigs, bit them, and showed they could definitely be used to spread something if the army wanted to take it further. Now the thing was a bunch of the bombs malfunctioned. Instead of waiting to deploy on the ground, they started releasing fleas in the planes before being dropped. So now there were swarms of fleas flying around inside the aircraft, biting the crew and technicians who were trying to drop the bombs in the first place. The fleas attacked the personnel so badly that they had to scrap some of the planned flights. And even the ground crews, who were supposed to observe what happened after the bombs dropped, got swarmed too. The guinea pigs were found crawling with fleas after each drop. Technicians would recover the animals and count how many fleas had made contact. That was their measure of success, how many fleas landed and bit. The data said they were extremely effective. The only problem was controlling where the fleas ended up. They didn't just stay put in one test area. Wind, terrain, and mechanical failure meant they spread unpredictably, including back onto the people running the whole thing. No one died, and again, the fleas weren't carrying disease during these tests, but the army now had proof that it could drop plague-carrying bugs from the sky, have them land, and still be capable of doing damage. The test was declared a success, but it was also a warning that once something living is part of your weapon, you lose control the moment it leaves the plane. Sarin nerve gas test. On May 6, 1953, 19-year-old Royal Air Force mechanic Ronald Madison showed up at Porton Down, a secretive military research facility in Wiltshire, thinking he'd signed up to help test a treatment for the common cold. That was the story the British Ministry of Defence fed to volunteers like Ronald. What he didn't know was that he was walking into a controlled nerve agent experiment using sarin, one of the deadliest chemical weapons developed during World War II. In that test, scientists applied a tiny droplet of liquid sarin directly onto Ronald's forearm using absorbent patches. They told him it would be safe, even though sarin had already been documented to cause seizures, paralysis, and death in mere minutes. Within seconds of contact, Ronald began to sweat uncontrollably and complained that he felt sick. Then, he collapsed, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. Medical staff on site rushed to try and save him, but by the time they moved him to a nearby hospital bed, his respiratory system had already started shutting down. He was dead within 45 minutes. Instead of owning up to what happened, the Ministry of Defense scrambled to keep it under wraps. They classified the entire experiment and told Ronald's father that his son had died in an unfortunate accident during routine tests. Ronald's body was buried quickly, and for decades, his family had no idea what had actually happened. Internally, the government continued running similar experiments. Nearly 300 British soldiers were exposed to nerve agents at Porton Down under the guise of medical or chemical research, all while being misled or outright lied to about what they were agreeing to. It wasn't until 2004, over 50 years later, that an inquest finally re-examined Ronald's death. The investigation concluded that his death had been unlawful and that volunteers like him had been misled into participating in experiments that clearly put their lives at risk. Documents showed that scientists at Porton Down were fully aware of how dangerous sarin was and had even documented its lethality. They continued using human subjects anyway, brushing aside consent protocols and ethical safeguards. Now let's get back to my question at the start of the video. How would you feel if I took you in a lab, made you drink copious amounts of seawater, and studied the effects because I don't know if seawater is safe to drink or not? Of course you'd feel angry, that's not legal even if they tried to make it seem like it. See y'all.